Week 11 of Super Rugby is gone with yet another long weekend. Our sport editor Garen and chief writer Rob are joining me in studio. Now, hello.
Hello, Jen.
Hi, Jen.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Not too bad, thank you.
Now, before we get into it, the loser was supposed to bring chocolates.
I have Jen. Yeah.
Yay!
Confessional. Confessional.
Excellent, so we'll have those afterwards. Okay, so obviously, Rob, your predictions weren't so great.
They weren't. I had a very bad weekend all round, Jen. I fell off my bicycle, and I also, you can say I fell off the bike in terms of my Super Brew predictions as well, because I got 1 from 6 at the weekend, 0 from 3 with the South African games, and just 1 correct result out of the 6. I suspect Garen might have done a tad better.
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear all of that. I see your battle scars there.
I'm okay. I'll survive.
Okay, good.
Don't feel too sorry for Rob. He'll be fine. Yeah, I was slightly better, but still not fantastic this weekend. The South African team's disappointed yet again, but and I don't draw much credit from correctly predicting that they would lose. So it's a bit bittersweet this morning.
All right, well, why don't you take us to the first game?
Okay, well, the first game was the Sharks up against the Highlanders in Durban, and I was quite shocked at how poorly the Sharks really played. I think Rob will probably agree with me. We predicted them to be fairly comfortable, sort of 6 to 10 point victors, and they ended up losing, I think, by 16. Yep. So they were never really in the game. The Highlanders were really, really impressive. And when they went into that game, they were actually the worst ranked New Zealand side, which just says something about the difference between the New Zealand Conference and the South African Conference at the moment. The Highlanders scored 4 tries. The Sharks couldn't even score 1. They were totally outplayed at home, which is even more worrying. More worrying than that, I guess, is the fact that they're now going on their overseas tour. So they're heading off on a losing note, which is never great. So, but we'll talk more about their tour later in the week. But getting back to the game, they were totally outplayed. I think Tim Swiel was a bit of an issue at fly half. He really hasn't stepped up. I wouldn't be surprised if Frans Steyn actually moved to number 10 for their overseas tour matches. But they just looked flat. They just looked like they didn't have a clue what was going on. There was sort of a division between their backline and their forwards. They weren't sort of gelling at all. We've talked in the past about the fact that they haven't put in this 80-minute performance, and they sort of have had this fantastic draw with all their matches at home up front, but they haven't really cashed in. They're still only 1 point ahead of the New Zealand conference leaders and the Australian conference leaders. So heading on their tour, they're probably not even favourites to top the log overall, I wouldn't say.
Well, that sounds like a big womp womp.
Yeah.
No, it was a real wake-up call. It really summed up the general plight of the South African Conference, that our best team got so slaughtered. As Garen said, 4 tries to 0 at home is a very damning sort of statistic. And all the Sharks could manage were 6 penalties, I think, which said a lot about the sort of bluntness of their attack. It was a very damaging result in terms of the overall log, because they're now only a point ahead of the Brumbies with their tour about to start. So the Sharks are probably, in the eyes of many neutrals around the world, probably no longer the favourites to actually top the overall log, which of course does mean a home final at the end of the season. So it's something you want to try to achieve, and they couldn't do it. I just thought some of the senior Sharks players were very poor on Friday night. Frans Steyn had a bit of an off day after being in really good form earlier in the season. JP Peterson looked a bit shaky out on the wing. In the pack, some of their remaining senior guys didn't do particularly well. And of course, I suppose you can say in their defence that before the kickoff, they had a bit of a surprise in having to lose both their captain Bismarck du Plessis and Jean Deysel, who are 2 very important forwards who bring quite a lot of sort of grunt into their pack. And that seemed to sort of knock them a little senseless before the game even started. And then they just seemed to be on the back foot from then on. So a very poor result from them. Let's hope it's just simply that they're going through that little sort of mental trough where they've just got a bit tired, and that they can lift themselves for the first tour game against the Rebels, which is very important now.
Well, not a great start to the weekend. Garen, did game 2 get any better?
No, it actually got a little bit worse. In fact, it was the Bulls up against the Force in Perth. It was the Bulls' final match of their tour, and they've also now returned home, having lost all 4 of their games. It's the 3rd South African team to go overseas. We've lost all 12 games now, so not great from their point of view. And this game was particularly awful to watch. It rained a bit. There were no tries in the match. It ended 15-9, just penalties. The Bulls, at times they looked like they were threatened to break out and score and even win the match, but they sort of something just held them back. It was difficult to sort of understand what they were trying to do at times, kicking away a lot of possession when they had it. Their pack on paper looked like they should dominate their opponents, but they didn't really play to their strengths. They picked up their 4th losing bonus point, which is about the only good thing to say about the performance. But they'll be back now at Loftus. They're far better at home at altitude. I think they'll get it slightly better in the remaining weekends, but they've already played 10 games, which I think leaves them with 6 to go. So, no chance, I wouldn't say, of reaching the playoffs. So we've got one South African team in the playoffs at the moment, and I don't think it's going to get any better for us, unfortunately, Rob.
No, it's not. I think the Bulls are now out of it, Jen. I don't think that they've got a chance at the playoffs. Funnily enough, the only route now that they could perhaps have is if the Sharks have an absolute shocker on tour and also lose 3 or 4 of their tour games, which touch wood won't happen. But if that was to happen, then the Bulls could still make up a little bit of ground, perhaps if they get a few wins back in South Africa, because all their games, of course, now are back in South Africa, and obviously quite a few of them at Loftus. But the most they can get to now is 9 wins. They've got 6 games left, as you said. If they were to win them all, they could now only get to 9 wins, which history shows in the new conference system isn't really enough to get you usually into the playoffs. You normally need 10 wins. So it's looking very dicey now. It was infuriating that they lost that game, because once again it was a game that they had opportunities to win. Possibly they packed it enough to actually secure that game, Gary, and I thought they worked hard. They did make some costly errors at times. Some of the handling was absolutely atrocious despite the wet conditions. I mean, let's face it, a lot of New Zealand teams play in wintry, wet conditions all the time anyway, and still manage to spin the ball quite effectively. Yet our guys seem to make it look far more of a cake of soap than perhaps it is. So it's not looking good, and the Bulls came back with their tails between their legs. It's not often that they come back these days winless from their four-match overseas tour.
All right, Garen, put us out of our misery. Let's get through Game 3.
It got slightly better, but only because it was a South African derby and there had to be a winner. And that winner was the Cheetahs at home against the Stormers. The Stormers have now dropped to 15th and last in the overall conference, and obviously last in the South African conference as well. Cheetahs have just moved ahead of them into 14th, so nothing to really write home about there. It was, again, a strange game. I predicted that the Cheetahs would win, but I wasn't that certain about it. I thought it would be pretty close. And the first 10 minutes, I thought, oh no, I'm going to be wrong here, because the Stormers really looked impressive. They scored 10-0 up after 10 minutes, scored a great try, looked really in control and command of the match. And then I don't know what happened. It was like a switch flicked, and they were absolutely useless for not only the rest of that half, but most of the second half. Only in the dying minutes did they actually look like they remembered how to play some rugby. But credit to the Cheetahs, they scored 5 tries in that. After that 10-minute period, they came storming back. Some great tries actually. I was quite impressed with the way they handled the ball and passed it around, length of the field, trying stuff. So, they look far better on the day. I'm not sure what's wrong with the Stormers this year. Nothing seems to be working. Nothing's gelling. Senior players aren't standing up. Alistair Coetzee, I wouldn't say his job's on the line, but it's certainly not looking good for them. Again, they've been on their tour. They're back in South Africa. They're playing all their games at home and in the country. But I'm not even convinced that they're going to beat the Highlanders this weekend, let alone their matches against the remaining South African teams. So, dire times for the Stormers. It goes without saying that both them and the Cheetahs are out of conference or playoff contention already, with 7 games to go, I think, for the Stormers. So sad times if you're in the Cape Town and a Stormer supporter, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I was very silly, Jen. I backed the Stormers to win the game.
I know.
It was not a good decision. I should have actually perhaps factored in, Garen, the fact that the Cheetahs, because there was so little at stake in the game, I did fancy that it was going to be a sort of, quite an open, throw the ball around sort of match, which it did turn out to be, because there just wasn't that much at stake for the two bottom sides, and of course the Cheetahs just culturally are so much more suited to that sort of approach, and it proved on the day. I thought Willie Leroux was very good for the Cheetahs. He was back to his brilliant best in terms of creativity, and the Stormers were sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. They're trying to sort of evolve their game so that they're not all defence anymore. But while they've sort of started to up their attacking game a little bit and showed a few flashes of inspiration, their defence has now gone to pieces. So they're in a very experimental phase. And sadly, it looks as though that sort of volatility, if you like, in their performances will remain for the rest of the season from here on in.
Well, I'm excited because I get chocolate out of the whole thing. Garen, why don't you tell everyone who's watching how they can share their photos from the games and challenge your predictions next week?
Right, well, if you were in Durban on Friday night or at Bloemfontein on Saturday, please send us your pictures. We'd love to include them in our gallery, and have a look at our Super Brew standings, see how you did compared to us this weekend.